Hey, I'm Noam Weissman, and you're listening to Unpacking Israeli History, the podcast that takes a deep dive into some of the most intense, historically fascinating, and often misunderstood events and stories linked to Israeli history. We were supposed to release only one episode this week, the start of a three-part series about that horrible day and the horrible year that followed. But this is the Middle East, where things change faster than you can process them. And so this is the second episode we're releasing this week, which will explore the fittingly named Operation New Order, Mivtza Seder Hadash, which may have just upended the balance of power in the Middle East. This past Friday, as Bibi Netanyahu addressed the United Nations, the Israeli Air Force was preparing to hit a target that had eluded them for decades. This target was much stronger than Hamas, much wealthier and better equipped than Hamas. And unlike Hamas, it took direct orders from Iran. This was different. This target was behind the deaths of countless people around the world, including 12 beautiful, innocent children playing soccer on a balmy Saturday night this past July. Maybe you even forgot about that already because of how much has gone on since then. This target had smelled Israel's weakness after the horror of October 7th and began raining down rockets on Israel's north a day later, sending tens of thousands of Israelis into exile and effectively shrinking Israel's borders. People don't think about that enough. Israel's borders caved in. Israel became smaller as a result of this enemy. This target was Hassan Nasrallah, who led the Iranian terror proxy Hezbollah since 1992. For 32 years, he and his organization terrorized the world. In 1983 alone, they murdered 319 Americans in two massive bombings in Lebanon. They hijacked planes. They bombed embassies. And they made a special point of targeting Jews. In 1994, they bombed a Jewish center in Argentina, killing 85. My friend, colleague, and podcast co-host Michal Biton lost friends in that attack. I've put a link to our joint podcast, Wandering Jews, in the show notes. But now, Nasrallah and the rest of Hezbollah's leadership are gone. And though President Joe Biden has been urging de-escalation for months, his statement about the strike was unequivocal. Listen carefully, whether you're on the right, you're on the left, just listen to what Biden said. Hassan Nasrallah and the terrorist group he led, Hezbollah, were responsible for killing hundreds of Americans over a 4-decade reign of terror. His death from an Israeli airstrike is a measure of justice for his many victims, including thousands of Americans, Israelis, and Lebanese civilians. The United States fully supports Israel's right to defend itself against Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and any other Iranian-supported terrorist groups. Of course, Israelis don't need the American president to tell them that Nasrallah's death is a good thing for the flourishing of human civilization, and that includes Druze, Arab, and Palestinian citizens of Israel, no matter their religion. Shortly after the announcement, the Israeli-Palestinian social media personality Naz Daily posted to social media. This is what he said: Nasrallah was my terrorist. Each one of us grows up watching a terrorist on TV threatening to kill us. For many Americans, it was Osama bin Laden. For me, it was Nasrallah. Why? Listen to what he continues to say. I grew up in northern Israel. Every few years, Nasrallah would target us with a barrage of rockets. His rockets would be directed at nearby Jewish towns, but of course they miss and fall in Muslim towns in Israel. My town was one of them. Imagine the irony. U.S. college students cannot understand this. My terrorist is dead today. It's great news not just for me, but for many Syrians, Lebanese, Saudis, and Israelis. I am naively optimistic, but I hope today sends a signal to people in the Middle East that moderation, acceptance of reality, and coexistence is the only way. Terrorism will always end up in failure. Always. Even if it takes 32 years to arrive. That's from Naz Daily. All over the country, Israelis are celebrating. They're handing out sweets. They're chilling on the beach. And no matter where they are, they're blasting a Hebrew language ode to Nasrallah, written during the last Lebanon war in 2006, which breezily predicts Nasrallah's imminent demise. We'll talk more about those celebrations in a little bit, but first I want to reflect on a different Hebrew language song. 1 month after the carnage of October 7th, a relatively unknown rap duo released a rap track with a slangy title. Ness and Stilla had one hit under their belts, an ode to clubbing, with a sneaky feminist message underneath the lyrics about drinking till you can't stand up anymore. In fact, the actual lyric references Hezbollah as a synonym for a high so intense, it's explosive. But after October 7th, no one was rapping about drinking and parties. That's just not the vibe. Not at all. Most of the songs released in that time were songs of anguish and disbelief, with titles like The Last Dance and Homeland and Winter 23. But Ness and Stilla weren't interested in writing about grief. They wanted revenge. Revenge. And in their controversial, provocative, very provocative ode to the power of the IDF, they list the targets that Israel's coming for. In the past month, their words have started to seem less like revenge fantasy and more like prophecy. I'm going to do a slightly awkward rendition of their rap song in English, but let's check it out. Let's try this out. Cross out another target. Every dog has his day. Wait till we rain fire on you, mofos. They probably don't say mofos. Every dog has his day. Everyone who planned, everyone who supported, everyone who carried out, everyone who murdered. Every dog has his day. You're in trouble. You heard? Now check this out. Nasrallah. Every dog has his day. Mohammed Deif. Every dog has his day. Haniya. Every dog has his day. Mohammed Deif was the head of Hamas's military arm. Ismail Haniya was the chairman of the Hamas political bureau. Both had undoubtedly been part of coordinating the attacks of October 7th. Nasrallah may not have known or helped plan the attack, but 24 hours after the worst slaughter of Jews in nearly a century, he made the fateful decision to join hands with Hamas and open what he called a northern front against Israel. That is not the behavior of human beings. That's the behavior of vultures. For 11 months, Israel's north has burned. For 11 months, Israel has played defense, often not very well. Not anymore. Watching the events of the past few weeks, it seems that the Israeli policy has officially shifted back towards deterrence, to the Talmud's injunction that if one comes to kill you, rise and kill first. And I'll give you examples. First, it was the assassination of Fuad Shukr, Nasrallah's military advisor, in retaliation for Hezbollah's murder of 12 Druze children in Majd al-Shams. And then, within a matter of weeks, the IDF declared open season on Hezbollah. They struck a weapons facility. Then, they took out all of Hezbollah's pagers and walkie-talkies, purposely low-tech devices that can't be tracked or hacked. The explosions left hundreds of Hezbollah leaders maimed or dead, with no way to communicate, hollowing out their chain of command. 2 days later, Israel assassinated the commander of Hezbollah's most elite strike force. Then came the strikes on Hezbollah's command centers and weapon depots. This past Friday was the Piece de Resistance, the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, and with him, the rest of Hezbollah's leadership. 1 day later, they got the guy who had been named Nasrallah's successor. He had held the job for only a few hours. Jewish and Hebrew Twitter accounts are having a field day. Some of the memes are funny, I have to admit. Fake job postings for head of Hezbollah, with caveats like no long-term commitment required. Reflections that the next leader of Hezbollah wasn't important enough to get a pager. People jokingly begging Israel to stop with all the strikes since they're too hungover from the last one to celebrate properly. If you ask me, that's a missed opportunity to quote DJ Khaled's epic album title, Suffering from Success. But we are Jews. And so amid the celebrations and the memes and the gifts or GIFs, I never know which one to say, but you know what I'm saying, many of us have also been asking ourselves, should we really be celebrating? Sure, Nasrallah was unquestionably a bad guy who did horrific things. That's not the interesting intellectual question. Debating that, not so interesting. But a broader question is interesting. Should Jews really celebrate the death of another human being? Should Americans? Should the West? How do we think about this as human civilization? Shlomo Brody, who has been one of my teachers for years, as well as a guest on this show, explains the following. According to some sources, this is the reason why the Bible does not call Passover a time of joy, and why Jews do not recite a full celebratory Hallel service after the first day of the festival. As the verse in Proverbs states, when your enemy falters, do not rejoice, and when he stumbles, do not feel glee, lest God notice and disapprove and avert his anger from him. In fact, during the Passover Seder, it's customary to pour out wine while reciting the 10 plagues in order to show sympathy with the Egyptians, who, by the way, were pretty bad to the Jews. But on the other hand, the book of Proverbs also declares, when evildoers are destroyed, there is joy. So, it kind of says the opposite. Which leads me to a very important theological question. If King David were around today, would he be reposting Hezbollah memes? I'm not the only one asking that question. Well, okay, I'm probably the only one asking the question in that particular way because that's me. But as Rabbi Brody writes, quote, a different approach emerges in the writings of Rabbi Jonah of Gerona, the 13th century Spanish scholar. He believed that the acceptability of an individual celebration depended on the nature of his or her intent. If one's merriment, that's an English word for joy, focused on the downfall of another human being, it would be morally problematic. If one celebrated the removal of evil from the world and the manifestation of divine justice, however, it would be a laudable act of sanctifying the name of God. In other words, you can make a case that the more tasteful memes are an act of service to God. So I thought about this, and then I thought maybe I have my own take, courtesy of another text in Jewish tradition. This is what it says. I'll say it in English. Rabbi Simon, the son of Lachish, said, sometimes our well-intentioned kindness, when directed to cruelty, can lead to cruelty when there should be kindness. In other words, being too nice to the bad guys will lead to us being bad to the nice guys. I'll say it in Hebrew. Kom mi shena'asa rachman bimkom achzari, sof shena'asa achzari bimkom rachman. That's the Hebrew. It's kind of amazing that these are the questions that Jewish people and Israelis across the world are asking themselves. Like, one of the worst people to inflict the most harm and to cause the most trauma was killed, and the most Jewish thing of all is to actually ask, should we be happy? Should we not be happy? Most normal people, most sane human beings across the world, when their number one enemy is killed and the person leading to terror and torture of other people is killed, they don't think so theologically and philosophically and deeply about these questions. People didn't wonder, how should I respond when Osama bin Laden was killed? How do I deal with that? People were kind of just like, yeah, he tore down the Twin Towers. Pretty good that he's no longer with us. But something's different about Israel. Something's different about how Israelis feel, how Jews typically feel about themselves and how others perceive them. And I'm not the first person to notice a significant mismatch between how Israel perceives itself and how the Western world, let's call it the liberal world, sees it. I've always wondered why that is. Why the only democracy in the Middle East? Yes, it's imperfect. Yes, an imperfect democracy. Okay, imperfect. I said it. With all its technological and medical innovations, with its record on gay rights, again, imperfect, but there. With its decades-long policy of negotiations, with its openness to the peace process, has racked up more condemnations from the UN than any other country, including North Korea, China, Venezuela, Syria, Iran, all the heavy hitters of human rights violations. And look, I'm not blind. I understand that Israel's occupying another people in the West Bank. No, not occupying the land. It says Jewish land as exists in the entire world, but the population who lives there, they are being occupied. They're being administered, to paraphrase the great Yossi Klein HaLevi. I'm not blind to the fact either that Israel has made many unfulfilled promises of equality to its Arab citizens and particularly to the Arab residents of East Jerusalem. I'm not blind to the fact that, like most countries, the Jewish state has a ways to go in terms of full racial integration. It's a cliche at this point to lament Israel's bad PR, but I think it's a tired and misguided excuse and frankly a poor diagnosis. And when I read Walter Russell Mead, who wrote an incredible book, The Ark of a Covenant, I finally understood why. Why is there such a mismatch? It's so important to understand this because Israelis and Jews across the world are feeling so misunderstood, but he explains it so crisply. Let me read to you what he writes. He writes, the single most important thing about Israel that most Americans do not understand is that the Jewish state was founded on a reasonable and historically justified skepticism about the ability of the liberal order to protect Jews. He explains that liberalism and Zionism clashed with each other as far back as Herzl's time. Liberal 19th century Jews believed that enlightened values would save them and finally allow them to live with dignity. They could be fully integrated. And then came the Zionist movement to poo-poo that concept. Herzl wrote, international institutions cannot save the Jews. Democracy cannot save the Jews. Good intentions cannot save the Jews. Herzl died in 1904, nearly 3 decades before the rise of Hitler. He lived through many pogroms. He saw the Dreyfus affair. He knew what was coming. And even then, he correctly predicted a catastrophe was coming. And he knew that the only thing to save the Jews would be, there's only one thing that would save the Jews. Okay, God, for those theologically inclined, but there's only one thing to save the Jews. And that was the Jews, on the Jews' terms, in their country as a sovereign power. And for the past year, think about this, everyone. For the past year, since the 7th of October, nothing has ever seemed truer. As Mead writes, many Israelis believe that if the Jewish state relied on the international community for its survival, it would have perished long ago. Now pause as you think about that. Think about his point for a second. He starts listing endless examples. I'll just list some. The UN voted for partition, but did not try to enforce it. No one came to Israel's aid when 5 Arab states invaded. The UN Charter says that member states have to respect the territorial integrity of other states, and yet Iran and others regularly announce plans to destroy Israel. The reaction among the international community? Crickets. Next example, in 1967, when the Israelis asked Washington to prevent Nasser from blocking Israeli sea traffic, the US and UN were equally checked out. You might remember the searing New York Times op-ed from the time that lambasted the UN General Secretary Utan as having the objectivity of a spurned lover and the dynamism of a noodle. My favorite insult ever, though I do like noodles. As Mead puts it, all this proves that Herzl was right. If the Jewish people entrust their survival to liberal institutions and liberal ideas, they will die. And listen, I'm an American. There's no greater expression of liberal values than the United States, in my humble opinion. No country has been better to its Jews. I'll always be proud and grateful to be an American citizen. And yes, the United States of America also has a ways to go in many, many issues. But I love being an American. But too many of my fellow Americans are lamenting Nasrallah's assassination, taking to the streets with Hezbollah flags. Too many blame the development of Hezbollah on Israel. And I'm not talking about pasty trolls in their mom's basements. So sad. I'm talking about brilliant, savvy, sophisticated, charming, knowledgeable journalists like Mehdi Hassan. I know, he sounds British. Turns out he's British American. I'm not even calling Mehdi disingenuous. I think he believes what he says. And I know as well as anyone that teaching history is a complicated process and a difficult game. Anyone who listens to this podcast knows I have no problem criticizing Israel's record. Yes, I love the Jewish people, but that does not mean I'm blind to Israel's weaknesses and their historically dangerous decisions. I'm not blind to Deir Yassin. I'm not blind to Kfar Qasim. I'm not blind to Kibbutz. I'm not blind to Sabra and Shatila. I've shared all those stories. That's actually something that this podcast does. It goes into the good, the bad, the ugly. And that's why when I look at people like Mehdi Hassan blaming Israel for the rise of Hezbollah, and I'm just intellectually thrown off. I was going to say horrified, but I held back. I'm so intellectually thrown off. I look at people who say that Israel deserves what they get, who go so far as to mourn Hassan Nasrallah's death. And I don't understand how we inhabit the same universe. Like, I want to have full empathy. I really do. How could we think this way? Well, it starts with asking the question, when did this whole thing start? When did the war between Israel and Hezbollah start? It's a question that determines the narrative we're each telling. If you ask me, and this is my bias, the answer is not October the 8th, 2023. The answer, and yes, we could go back to 1903 Kishinev, and yes, we go back to 1917 Balfour, and yes, we go back to the 19th century, go to 1840, the Damascus Blood Libel, we go to 1936 and talk about the Arab Revolt. We could talk about a lot of different moments in modern history. I want to start with 79, because 79 something changed the landscape in the Middle East. In 79, Ayatollah Khomeini overthrew the Shah in Iran, and he declared the following: Islam has been dying or dead for 1400 years. We have resurrected it with the blood of our youth. Very soon we will liberate Jerusalem and pray there. Now, why is this interesting? Listen to what else he said. He then charmingly described the United States of America as Great Satan and Israel as the Little Satan. How do you liberate Jerusalem all the way from Iran? The two countries don't share borders, and Iran has never actually marched with an army on the tiny Jewish state. For the first 8 years of the regime, they were too busy fighting their next-door neighbor, Iraq. But Khomeini was a big thinker, and he was savvy. He knew that he would never, quote-unquote, liberate Jerusalem without help. So he built a second arm of the regime. The more fronts he could build, the more the revolution would spread, and the closer he would get to liberating Jerusalem. In his fabulous book, Rise and Kill First, Ronen Bergman recounts that even before he took over Iran, Khomeini had his eye on exporting the Shia revolution all over the Muslim world. He sent his buddy Ali Akbar Motashamipur, my apologies to Motashamipur and the whole family if I got that wrong, as well as others in his inner circle to scout the best locations. Lebanon seemed like a no-brainer. Like, if you're wondering how Hezbollah got to Lebanon, this is the story, this is it. Yes, he chose one of the most diverse countries in the Middle East as the new front in the Islamic Revolution. A country that was like 30-ish% Christian, 30-ish% Sunni, and 30-ish% Shia, with a few other minorities sprinkled in there, Alawites, Ismailis, Druze. Back then, there were even a handful of Jews in the country. But Lebanon was also burning. It was in the middle of a nasty sectarian civil war. The government had more or less lost control. Syria had been meddling in the war for years, hoping to extend its own influence. So once Khomeini came to power, he made a very, very smart move. He appointed Ali Akbar Motashamipur as his ambassador, not to Lebanon, but to Syria. Syria's leader, Hafez al-Assad, was a secularist and an Alawite. He wasn't in love with Iran's revolutionary Shia Islamism. See, this is all very confusing. Sometimes people, and if you're listening, be kind to yourself. You might not know the difference between Shiites and Sunnis. You might think that all Muslims are necessarily best friends with each other. But there's divides, and I want to remind everyone, the Saudis are really the leaders of the Sunni world, and Iran are really the leaders of the Shia world. And Palestinians are Sunnis, and Hezbollah is Shiites. It's different. But he and the Iranians, meaning Motashamipur, and the Iranians had a mutual enemy. But he, Assad, and Motashamipur had a mutual enemy. Iran and Syria, Shiites and Sunnis and Alawites, had a mutual enemy at this point. An enemy that Iran called Little Satan. An enemy that had utterly destroyed Assad's beloved Air Force back in 1967 when he was commander of the Air Force and Minister of Defense. So in July of 1982, Assad okayed a military alliance with Iran that would allow Motashamipur to operate in Lebanon. Motashamipur was savvy. He didn't just enter Lebanon shouting, "Time to get Israel, who's with me?" Like Hamas's spiritual founder Ahmed Yassin, he started out providing social and religious programs for Lebanon's long-neglected Shia community. Only after he started building schools, mosques, welfare programs, medical clinics, and the like did he begin recruitment into the Party of God, or in Arabic, Hezbollah. That's what Hezbollah means. A lot of people are wondering, what's the deal with supporting a terrorist organization like Hezbollah? But only if you understand that it comes out of this appreciation from schools and mosques and welfare programs and medical clinics does it start making sense. Still though, from the start, Hezbollah was radical, and not like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Rad, a very different type of radical. One of their religious leaders, Sheikh Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah, wrote in a February 1983 essay, "Jihad is bitter and harsh. It will well up from inside by virtue of effort, patience, and sacrifice, and the spirit of willingness to sacrifice oneself." That spirit of self-sacrifice took the form of suicide bombs, a lot of them. On April 18, 1983, Hezbollah sent a suicide bomber to the U.S. Embassy in Beirut that killed 63 people, including 8 CIA officers. Among them was Lebanon's CIA station chief, Robert Ames, who the CIA director described as the closest thing to an irreplaceable man. The hits continued, masterminded by a man who some called the Ghost. The United States claims that Imad Mughniya was responsible for more American deaths than anyone in the world, at least until 9/11. Mughniya was a founding member of Hezbollah. From the start, they made it clear. They were dangerous. You can't kill a man who isn't afraid of death. And yet somehow, a decade after its founding, Hezbollah managed to become more extreme. After the Lebanese civil war ended, one of Hezbollah's co-founders, Abbas Musawi, took charge of the organization. Musawi wasn't exactly a teddy bear. He hated Israel. He was cool with suicide bombings. Many believe that he was the guy behind the kidnapping, torture, and murder of UN Marine Corps Colonel William Richard Higgins, who had joined the UN peacekeeping mission in Lebanon. So what did Israel do? You guessed it. Israel assassinated Musawi in 1992. Here's the complication that I want you to think about. Is the devil you know better than the devil you don't know? Because after Musawi was assassinated, his protege was someone by the name of Hassan Nasrallah. And that protege, Nasrallah, took power. Even by Hezbollah standards, Nasrallah was extreme. His first order of business was to unleash Mughniya, who many described as, quote, this is a quote, an uninhibited psychopath who was beating up prostitutes to export his reign of terror across the globe, targeting Israelis and Jews in particular. So what was the reaction to Musawi's assassination? This is what they did. First, they bombed a synagogue in Turkey. 2 weeks later, they set off a car bomb in Buenos Aires in Argentina, killing 29 people, including 20 children. Hezbollah dedicated the bombing in the memory of Hussein, Musawi's son, who was killed along with his father. Nasrallah and Mughniya were very open about why they were doing all this. Ready? Here's the quote. This is one of our continuing strikes against the criminal Israeli enemy in an open-ended war, which will not cease until Israel is wiped out of existence. When Israel killed 50 Hezbollah trainees, Hezbollah retaliated by murdering 85 people at an Argentinian JCC. Top Israeli brass started to wonder, did they make the right decision to kill Musawi? Think about it. Two perspectives emerged. Number one is Major General Uri Sagi later said, I did not accurately foresee Hezbollah's reaction. It was too hasty a decision-making process. But Chief of Staff Ehud Barak saw it differently. The question is, how did things look at the time of the act? It was difficult to see he would be replaced by Nasrallah. It was also difficult to know that Mugnia would become his number two, who turned out to be super talented at operations. None of us know what would have happened if Israel didn't assassinate Musawi. It's one of those historical what-ifs that I'm so fascinated by. I love asking the what-if question. And none of us know what will happen now that Nasrallah is gone. Is this the end of Hezbollah? Is it the start of a formal Iran-Israeli war? After all, Israel didn't just get rid of the top guy. They took down most of the chain of command too. But there's a bigger question at play here. Something that's even more global than what I'm focused on right now. Ronen Bergman writes the following, that since World War II, Israel has assassinated more people than any other country, developing, quote, the most robust, streamlined assassination machine in history. How do we think about that? How do we feel about that? In Bergman's words, quote, of all the means that democracies use to protect their security, there is none more fraught and controversial than, quote, killing the driver. Are these killings effective? Do they make the world a better place? Was killing Musawi a net positive, considering it unleashed Hassan Nasrallah on the world? What about killing Osama bin Laden, or Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, or Imad Mugnia? Do assassinations bring justice to all the people they killed? More importantly, what does this mean for the future? Does the end justify the means? If it cripples Hezbollah, if it deters future attacks, if it brings tens of thousands of Israelis back to their homes, does it then become morally justified? Or is it already morally justified? In a previous episode, this is the way I put it. You can and should ponder the ethics of a targeted assassination, of bioweapons, of enticing agents to betray their countries, of entering sovereign countries uninvited and killing its high-profile residents. And all those questions are valid, and whatever response you have to them is valid too. But I hope you'll remember the following, as you're considering the ethics of a targeted assassination. A government has a responsibility to keep its people safe. And as a nation, we're still getting used to the idea that we might have some power after 1900 years without collective power. If that power is deployed carefully, strategically, with the intent of keeping us safe, then I am comfortable standing in the gray area. I actually love it. And I'm grateful, and I think we should all be grateful, for all the agents who shoulder the burdens and make the tough decisions that we might not be able to make. Menachem Begin once famously told Joe Biden, a senator at the time, I am not a Jew with trembling knees. In other words, I am not afraid of my own power. Jews are no longer afraid of their own power. 40-some years later, that lesson stands. Israel made a commitment all those years ago to keep the Jewish people around the world safe. Let's be clear about this. The state of Israel failed its people by not keeping to that hallowed commitment on October 7th. They failed. But these attacks on Hezbollah, and to a lesser extent Hamas, are restoring its deterrence, one assassination at a time. It is sui generis. It is unprecedented what Israel just did to Hassan Nasrallah. Will this work? Will this be the thing that finally makes Israelis and Jews around the world feel safe? I don't know. I'm not Nostradamus. But here's one enduring lesson as I see it. We're going to have to wait and see. Given the circumstances, I'm hopeful. But for now, one of the biggest threats to the US and Israel has been eliminated. And even though I won't make jokes or share funny memes, I think that counts as a good day. I want to go back to the week of October the 7th. Within a week, Micha Goodman was interviewed by the Times of Israel. And Micha Goodman is an Israeli philosopher, but he said something that was more prophetic than philosophical. He explained there are two competing goals for Israel: to be loved by the West and feared by its neighbors. In some ways, these goals are mutually exclusive. Israelis want two things. This is what he said.
We want two things. We want love and we want fear. We want love from the West. We want fear from the Middle East. There's a zero-sum game between these emotions. Because here's how it goes. Everything that we are going to do to restore the fear is going to erode the love. Everything we do that will guarantee that the Middle East is afraid of Israelis, of these crazy, unpredictable Israelis, everything we do in order to build that myth back again is going to make people in the West not like us, not love us. And the other way around, if we will try to keep the West loving us and writing songs about us, we will not restore the fear of the Middle East from us. So it's a zero-sum game. And if people are asking questions about what can they do to help us, here's what you can do. Break the zero-sum game.
And what Goodman meant is the following. Don't force us into a scenario where we can't take care of ourselves in order to gain love from you. Allow us to defend ourselves. Allow us to take the agency into our own hands. Allow us to be Zionists. Allow us to stand up for ourselves. Allow us to take care of the business that we need to take care of. Allow us to eliminate the greatest terrorist that was alive today. Allow us to do that. Break the zero-sum game. Since then, Goodman changed the formulation of the zero-sum game to deterrence versus legitimacy. And for Israelis, they've made their decision. They've gone for deterrence. One addendum to these thoughts from Goodman. Perhaps by demonstrating how far Israel was willing to go, the Sunni Muslims and the West will come to maybe not love Israel more, but have a bit more respect. Nevertheless, wherever anyone stands on assassinations, and where you stand on whether fear or love should be the priority, whether deterrence or legitimacy should win the day, I will always believe that it's about the education. The head of the snake may have been killed, but if the educational worldviews remain the same, who knows? Maybe the next leader of Hezbollah will be more extreme than Nasrallah. Maybe. But maybe there will be a moderating force within Iran and within Hezbollah that says enough is enough. Israel is here to stay, and we will put down our guns and make peace. And so we pray. Unpacking Israeli History is a division of Unpacked, which is part of OpenDor Media. Our producer for this episode is Rifki Stern. Our editor is Rob Pera. And my writer is the brilliant Adi Elbaz. And that is the show.